Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public talk series and the final event in our Voice to Truth series. My name is Greg Lehman. I'm the Pro Vice-Chancellor Aboriginal Leadership, and I'd like to say Ya Palingina, welcome to the traditional lands of the Moanina people who knew this place as Nipaluna. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal community members who are with us tonight, and especially those elders who have joined us, and in particular the elders who will be speaking to you all this evening. And thank you everybody who have made the time to come along this evening, and also thank you to those who are joining us online. To host our panel this evening, please join me in welcoming the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, Professor Rufus Black.
Thank you, Greg, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the University of Tasmania, I warmly welcome you to tonight's Island of Ideas Forum, Voice to Truth. This is the third and final of the three Voice to Truth forums that the University has hosted. Each of these has had a different focus, hearing from different people. The first was from younger people discussing what this means for the future and for their future. In the second, we heard from two long-time campaigners talking about how we came to this moment, encapsulated in the Uluru Statement from the heart and its call for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice. Tonight, we'll hear from different perspectives again, exploring what the alternative paths to creating a more equitable future might be. And again, we'll hear from leaders in their communities, both long-time campaigners, activists and advocates for their communities, Kerry, Sculthorpe and Michael Mansell. And so it is my pleasure to introduce you to the first of our speakers tonight, Kerry Skulthorpe. She's a well-known and highly respected senior member of the Palawa community. She is the great-great-granddaughter of Fanny Smith, one of the 47 survivors of the 300 Aboriginal people sent to the Waibalena settlement on Flinders Island in 1831. Amid great diversity, Kerry's grandmother, as the family call her, embraced her Indigenous identity and consented to recordings of her voice in language. They're the oldest voice recordings ever made of an Australian Aboriginal person, according to the National Film and Sound Archive. They capture the last fluent speaker of any of the original Tasmanian Aboriginal languages. They now play an important part in the work to recover and reclaim Indigenous language in Tasmania. It's fitting that Kerry, following the footsteps of a great matriarch, is a voice for her people today. She has 4 decades of experience in government policy, administration and ethics in relation to Aboriginal Australians. She has held elected roles, advocated for Aboriginal rights and served as a senior public service executive. Kerry's most recent contributions to the advocacy of her people included participation in the government's Voice Co-Design Committee. This committee was part of the Voice Co-Design process, consulting on regional and local options for how a voice could work. Now retired, Kerry remains active in her advocacy by sharing her insights on Aboriginal issues in newspapers and public forums such as this one. Please join me and provide a warm welcome to Kerry Skulthorpe.
I speak to you this evening not as a diplomat and not as part of a leadership or a campaign team. I speak as an observer of Aboriginal affairs and politics with a lived experience of more than 40 years working both inside and outside of government. In 1967, the Australian people voted to remove 2 sections from the Constitution. The section that said the Commonwealth could legislate for all people, except for the Aboriginal people, and the section that said Aboriginal natives would not be counted in the Australian population census. 56 years later, we're being asked to add a section to the Constitution. The addition, in part, will say, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. And I just want to dwell on that point. What does it mean to be the first peoples? So there are some distinguishing features of First Peoples everywhere. They used to be called Indigenous. They have all been colonised, dispossessed of their lands, have endured genocidal policies designed to wipe out their cultures and languages, and in some cases, their very lives. And they are all minorities in countries governed by other cultures. They do not come from the same Western traditions as do their colonisers. Their philosophies, ways of thinking and being, their languages and cultures have all been formed through perspectives and experiences totally foreign to Western traditions. The interdependence of the people and their total environment is a shared feature of the Indigenous life experience across the globe. These cultures have come to be regarded as having special value to the world today because they are rare, they have intrinsic value, and they have been at risk due to the relentless march of colonialism. The United Nations recognised this in 2007 when 144 countries voted in the General Assembly to accept the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Declaration had been 23 years in the making. And bear with me, I want to quote directly from parts of the actual declaration. The introduction, in part, says, affirming that Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples, while recognising the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such. Affirming also that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilisations and cultures, which constitute the common heritage of humankind. Convinced that control by Indigenous peoples over developments affecting them and their lands, territories and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, cultures and traditions, and to promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs. Convinced that the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples in this declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and Indigenous peoples based on principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination and good faith. And bear with me just a little longer, I want to quote 3 of the articles. Article number 4. Indigenous peoples, in exercising their rights to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. This means that the people of the Torres Straits, for example, should be able to govern themselves, which is something they have been patiently asking for since at least the 1980s. Article 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social and cultural life of the state. And this means that the Indigenous One Nation No campaigners can choose not to participate in Indigenous specific institutions, but to join in with the majority population. But they should not be arguing against the right of other Indigenous people to have their own institutions. And as for the non-Indigenous No campaigners, well, in my opinion, they shouldn't be having anything at all to say on the subject. Now I'll go to Article 19. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Now, most countries around the world have accepted that Indigenous peoples hold a special status in society, and they've put in place special measures and protections to ensure that their human rights can be enjoyed to the same extent as the majority populations are able to exercise their rights and freedoms. In Finland, for example, the Sami Parliament has the right to negotiate with the Government of Finland on certain matters. They have the right to decide, without right of appeal, the allocation of Sami funds. The Sami Parliament Act sets out the obligations of the Government of Finland towards the Sami people. The change to the constitution in Norway in 1988 said, "It is the responsibility of the authorities of the state to create the conditions enabling the Sami people to preserve and develop its language, culture and way of life." The Guatemalan Constitution has recognised the rights of Indigenous people since 1985. In Angola, collective rights of peoples are recognised alongside individual rights. The Republic of the Congo has adopted special measures to protect the rights of 2 of its Indigenous peoples. The Constitution of Bangladesh has had special provisions to protect the rights of vulnerable groups since 1972. The Serbian Constitution recognises both individual and collective rights. Other countries which have included parts of the United Nations Declaration in their constitutions to ensure the protection of rights such as self-determination and self-government include Bolivia, Colombia, Peru and Ecuador. In 1974, here in Australia, the very brave Queensland Conservative Senator Neville Bonner called for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to be properly recognised and for compensation to be paid by the government for dispossession and subsequent injustices caused by colonialism. Let's skip ahead. In the 21st century, here in Australia, there is no tolerance for the concept of the collective rights of First Nations peoples. There is no tolerance of difference. There's plenty of animated debate about whether or not we should even have a say in matters which affect our lives. There has never been, and there will never be, another civilisation that has longer, deeper, intellectual, spiritual and cultural traditions than the Indigenous people of this continent and its surrounding islands. The Australian state seems to attach no importance to such a thing. We continue to be discussed in terms of the problems we cause or the disadvantages we endure. Any suggestion that we might be accorded some of the rights acknowledged internationally is met with open hostility and aggression. We are being frequently reminded now of the need to have respectful debate on this topic before us. But the debate is about the continued subjugation of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the very institutions which are causing us harm. Calm and respectful debate about such a subject in the 21st century seems to me to be bizarre, to say the least. And we have now entered a realm where to call out racism is more abhorrent than to actually be a racist, where people with lived experience of deep racism are being bullied and harassed for even mentioning the word. For a generation now, the Australian government has been funding activity aimed at building national cohesion. Nation building, it's been called, mostly taking the form of reconciliation statements and action plans and other feel-good activities. Somehow, the poorest, unhealthiest 3% of the population are meant to benefit from this. From what we're seeing and hearing in the media, I don't think it's premature to call these campaigns a dismal failure. They certainly have not resulted in reduced suicide rates, reduced incarceration rates, or a reduced number of child removals. And they certainly have not curbed the hostility and aggression directed against Aboriginal people who dare to speak out about things that others don't want to hear. And make no mistake, these reconciliation-type activities have been funded from the Indigenous Affairs budget. It is not and should never have been the responsibility of the Indigenous people to bear the burden of nation building. We have higher and more immediate priorities. Those priorities have been detailed in many reports to government over the decades. They are still available to be read by anyone interested in listening to what Aboriginal people have to say. So, moving on, the referendum question goes on to say we should be recognised as the First Peoples through a voice which may make representations to the Australian Parliament and Executive Government. The Uluru Statement has not asked for a body with any authority or autonomy. It has simply asked to be able to give advice and leave others to make the decisions. It has not even used the words advisory body or representative organisation in case comparisons are made with unfairly discredited organisations of the past. Hence the word voice instead of organisation, which quite frankly has quite a few people bewildered. The composition, functions and operations of such a body will be legislated by the Parliament. The government is already ruling out things a voice will not be doing. The Minister has already decided what the priorities will be. She said so on the television. The Parliament has been assured that the voice will not impinge on the rights currently enjoyed by the majority population. The tone being set is that we are likely to see more behaviour management. The structures and institutions responsible for the unequal wellbeing outcomes between the Indigenous people and the majority population will not come under any examination. The Attorney General has told the Parliament that in developing the voice legislation, the government will seek the views of the wider Australian community. Imagine that. If seen in the context of the past generation of government-funded activity, getting us to this point, that is not so strange. All of the advisory committees which have reported to government on constitutional change have involved representatives of the majority. We know that of the 2,978 submissions received by the government's most recent Voice Advisory Committee, 6% were from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. 90% were from non-Indigenous people, and there were 4% who did not give their identity. So, people who will not be affected at all by an Indigenous advisory body to the Parliament do want to have their say about how it will be constituted and how it will operate. This is a long way from the self-determination the international community believes Indigenous people are entitled to. Now I want to get back to another quote, and here goes. Under this government, there has been more money spent on Aboriginal affairs, but without producing the results we had hoped for. The reason, we are told, is that we are dictating to Aboriginal people, not listening to them. The job of the NACC is to bring to the department, the Minister and the government in Canberra the wishes, the thinking and the aspirations of Aboriginal people out back. If we keep that in mind, we may achieve a lot. If your proposals are logical and justified, a government would reject them only at its peril. If we can cooperate, the annual allocation of money by the federal government can be used with much better results. Does this sound familiar? It's an extract from the speech by the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in February 1974, 50 years ago, to the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee. And I'll just mention this committee did get out of hand fairly early on when it decided to change its name. When advised of this, the Minister threatened to cut off its funding, so things soon settled down. This address by the Minister was to the first of 8 advisory bodies to government between 1973 and 2019. 4 of the bodies were elected, and some of you will remember, and 4 were hand-picked by the government and appointed. Now, according to the Prime Minister, the proposed voice is something new, a major shift in the administration of Aboriginal affairs, and it will change people's lives for the better. He was at some pains to repeatedly point out at the Gama Festival recently that previous governments had not noticed the 8 previous advisory bodies they had appointed, or did he mean they had been giving bad advice? All of them. Or that governments just hadn't bothered listening. Or perhaps they couldn't listen if the Constitution had not given them the authority to do so. It was John Howard, the One Nation advocate, who first publicly proposed recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the preamble to the Constitution in 2007. This was after he had instigated the abolition of ATSIC, invaded the Northern Territory communities, and basically managed to demonise all of Aboriginal Australia. Since that time, government has funded a string of committees and activity aimed at gaining consensus for a referendum which would acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Symbolic recognition was always rejected by the Aboriginal people. People in the Torres Straits have just wanted to govern themselves. The idea for an advisory body came from the Constitutional Convention at Uluru. It was out of frustration at governments and politicians not listening that it was decided to make a plea to the Australian people. But I think we've seen recently that politicians actually do represent the Australian people. Both the noble and the generous, and the dark underbelly, the ignorant and bigoted. It is clear to me that successive governments have been determined to get recognition into the Constitution by hook or by crook. And we could have done with some of that determination in some other areas of life, I would say. In 2013, the Commonwealth Parliament passed the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples Recognition Act as a first step towards a referendum. And in 2015, it extended the sunset clause of that legislation by another 5 years. Meantime, before the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was abolished in 2005, its budget was severely cut, forcing the closing down of many small local community-controlled organisations. When ATSIC was gone, the move began to shift funding for community services away from Aboriginal-controlled organisations to the non-government sector and to private business. As at December 2021, 39% of all grants paid out by the National Indigenous Affairs Agency, the government department, were being paid to 589 non-Indigenous corporations, charities and organisations. Perhaps the Prime Minister doesn't know these things, but I don't know any Aboriginal people who are advocating or who have advocated for the services to be provided to them by outsiders. And we have poor Minister Burney, who for most of her career has been one of those rare politicians who could actually engage in conversation about her portfolio responsibilities. She is now reduced to working with one hand tied behind her back, selling the Yes campaign. She has to remain a small target in true Labor Party style. The long campaign by governments of both persuasions to have symbolic recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian Constitution has succeeded in turning attention away from the lack of transparency and accountability by governments in the administration of Aboriginal policy and programs. Previous detailed recommendations about structural reform and quite specific measures to address the basic needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are continuing to gather dust. The recommendations in those reports are all based on direct representations from Aboriginal people. Now, Aboriginal policy has been reduced to 3 words: voice, treaty, truth. All of these things, if they happen at all, will take years to put in place. And in the meantime, there will be no attempt to address the institutional and systemic bias that has trapped many of our people in poverty and despair for generations. Voice, treaty and truth do not absolve the government of its responsibility towards its citizens. In a nutshell, we've been thrown to the wolves yet again. That 25 million people should be deciding by uninformed public debate about whether or not a population of less than 1 million should be allowed to have an organisation through which to express their views to the government is simply absurd. In a modern democracy, it is the responsibility of the government to protect the vulnerable, the marginalised and the dispossessed. It is also the responsibility of the government to put in place measures that enable Indigenous people to thrive in their own country in the manner of their own choosing. This is not happening here. The Prime Minister has been emphatic. A no vote will mean there'll be no change in the administration of Indigenous policy and programs. We are yet to see what might happen in the unlikely event of a yes win, but plenty of assurances have been given about what will not be happening. So, hope or hype, you be the judge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Our next speaker is Michael Mansell, an Aboriginal activist and lawyer who studied at this university, graduating in 1983. Michael has been a part of the struggle for his people, for land rights, for empowerment and justice since well before then, since well into the 1970s. He is the author of Treaty and Statehood, Aboriginal Self-Determination, which the Aboriginal Law Bulletin described as compulsory reading for all, providing a gentle but definitive invitation to Australian people to revisit self and to signify the type of nation Australia wants to be. He has successfully campaigned for the repatriation of Aboriginal ancestral remains from Britain, Europe and the United States, recognition of native title, cultural fishing, hunting and land rights, as well as compensation for the stolen generations. He is the former legal manager of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre and currently Secretary of the Aboriginal Provisional Government. The APG was established in 1990 to promote the idea that Aboriginal people should be able to, as close as possible, exercise the forms of self-government that existed prior to colonisation. Michael has devoted his life to his people, defending their rights in courts and pushing to change laws which adversely affect Aboriginal people. In recognition of this, in 2013, he was nominated for an Australia Day Award as Senior Australian of the Year, which he rejected on moral grounds. Michael said accepting an award on a day inextricably linked to the invasion of Australia by white settlers would be abandoning principle for personal glory. This strong conviction and advocacy has often struck a raw nerve with politicians and sections of the media, though others admire him for his courage and tenacity. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Michael Mansell.
I haven't come here tonight to try to convince anybody to vote yes or no, especially given that the polls have consistently over the last few months indicated that the referendum is going to be lost. Now, it doesn't mean that the polls are right, but if we are to take notice of the way the polls are going, most people in Australia have made up their minds, 1/3 to vote yes, the others are going to vote no. So what I wanted to do in a short space of time is to make two broad points. One is about looking at the proposal for the voice to Parliament to examine its merit. Secondly, to consider whether the path that has been adopted by the Yes campaign is the best path or whether it's the only path, that is, when you consider legislation on the one hand or the Constitution on the other. And the third main element I want to consider is whether the campaign for the Yes has adopted flexibility given the changing nature of public opinion and the politics of Liberal and Labor. So, having said that, the main thrust of the Yes campaign is to establish what I think is an acceptable phrase of a voice to Parliament. It sounds like an honourable and honest description of what it's about. But the commentary behind the Yes campaign when they talk about a voice to Parliament has always given the impression that Aboriginal people don't currently have a voice. Well, you only have to look at the television. Warren Mundine, Jacinta Price, Noel Pearson are on the bloody TV almost every day or in the media. We have 10 Aboriginals in the federal parliament, one of whom is the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs who sits in cabinet. So there's hardly a question that we don't already have a voice. So it did tend to undermine the argument on merit that Aboriginal people need some sort of voice because we don't currently have one. It does raise the question of whether the voice campaign, when they say we don't have an adequate voice, are talking about empowerment of Aboriginal people, which is a fair comment. The 1990 Deaths in Custody Royal Commission made the fundamental point that the domination of Aboriginal people to such an extraordinary extent over 200 years means that the disadvantage Aboriginal people suffer is a product of that domination. And so you could, when I first glanced at it, I thought they're not talking about constitutional recognition, they're talking about some form of empowerment. But that notion is undermined when you say, well, we're not going to go for 6 designated seats in the federal parliament, we're going to go for 24 people to sit in an advisory capacity to comment on things that the federal parliament or the federal government want to do. Purely advisory. So it's clearly not aimed at giving Aboriginal people some form of empowerment. If we had, as an alternative, 6 Aboriginal seats in the Senate, for those who are not familiar with the way the Senate is set up, each state, regardless of the population, is allocated 12 senators. Without changing the constitution, Albanese could legislate at any time because he's got the numbers in the lower house and he can get legislation through the upper house with the support of the Greens and the Independents. He could amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act at any time so that before the next election, one each of those 12 senators from the states could be an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander elected by Indigenous people. So if we're talking about empowerment, you shouldn't be talking about an advisory body. If you want people in the decision-making table, that's in the chamber of the federal parliament, not sitting outside the parliament making comment about what goes on inside. When we talk about the merit of the voice proposal, some of the claims that have been made about the effectiveness of the voice they are problematic. For example, one claim is that it will diminish racism. How can an advisory body meeting a few times a year effectively diminish racism in Australia? It defies logic. Another claim that is made is that it will close the gap. Prime ministers working with state governments and with all Aboriginal organisations and the peak Aboriginal organisations have not been able to reduce the difference between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people on a whole range of different targets. And let's take two of those targets to consider how the voice could approach the topics. One of the targets is that Aboriginal people around the country should own 15% of the land. In Tasmania, we own less than 1%. How can the advisory body sitting in Canberra force the Tasmanian government to hand over land to Aboriginal people, particularly when this government is legislating to completely demolish the land rights legislation that was set up by another Liberal government in 1995, so that instead of the Parliament acting on behalf of white Tasmanians and handing the land over to Aboriginal people and saying, we took it off you, we're giving it back to you, you look after it, the amendments are going to provide that the minister will decide which organisation is allocated any land that's given back. The land wasn't taken from organisations because they didn't exist in 1803. It was taken from the people. But what could an advisory body do about that? In Western Australia, Aboriginal people own 11% of the land in Western Australia. How can an advisory body, in rational thought and logical thinking, how can they give that other 4% back to Aboriginal people? Because one of the key elements that doesn't seem to have been taken into account in the Yes campaign is that the advisory body, if the referendum succeeds, is a creature of the federal parliament, not of the states. The high imprisonment rates in Western Australia, where Aboriginal people are 3% of the population, but 27% of the prison population, is a state matter. State police, state laws, state courts. What can a federal advisory body do about that? With the land question, it just seems to me that the advisory body that's being proposed by the Yes campaign didn't properly consider at Uluru the limitations of an advisory body created by the federal parliament. And there's a whole range of other things that this advisory body cannot do. For example, it cannot pass laws. It cannot prevent a racist law like the Northern Territory Intervention. It has no veto. It cannot return land to Aboriginal people. It can't deliver services. It can't raise revenue. In fact, when they talk about close the gap, this body cannot build a single house for homeless Aboriginal people. So the whole campaign for the Yes model has been based on emotion. It's been asking the Australian public, get on board with the idea. Don't consider rationally whether this thing can deliver the goods. Forget about that. Jump on board with the emotional idea. And you can see all of the reconciliation people, people who are genuinely trying to express their support for Aboriginal people, have jumped on board in a leap of blind faith. Because if they were considering whether this voice could actually deliver the goods, they wouldn't jump on board. They would say we need to look at alternatives. And in terms of the alternatives, I must mention, how many of you got this in the letterbox today? A few? Only me? Oh, a couple of us, right. I've been targeted. I am part of what they call the progressive no's. That is, with all of the things that have happened to Aboriginal people, we deserve something better than an advisory body. So I'm not trying to convince you, but we oppose the referendum because there are better paths to go. But the Conservative no's, constituted or led by Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price, have sent around this document that I saw in my letterbox tonight. And they say the voice will divide Australians. Why will it? Because people are going to a referendum? Isn't that democracy at work? If we have elections every 4 years and half the country vote Labor and half the country vote Liberal, we all say, that's not division, that's democracy. So if we have a referendum, half the people vote one way, half the people vote the other way, why isn't that democracy at work? Why is that a division? It's division because Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine want to make it division. They go on to say, Australia is not a racist country. We are the envy of the world. The Yes campaign have never argued whether Australia is racist or otherwise. They have simply said, we believe there should be an advisory body to advise the federal parliament. They never raised any question about how racist or unracist Australia was. So when we talk about division, it's being fomented by this pair. One comment I must make about the flexibility of the Yes campaign. They should have realised that the merit of the idea of a voice to Parliament wasn't making any headway in 2023. It had made headway in 2022 because the polls indicated that. But when people like David Littleproud, head of the National Party, came out and said, I can't see how this advisory body is going to close the gap. Instead of making fun of his name and of him, as Noel Pearson did, what a wonderful opportunity was presented to the Yes campaign to explain how this advisory body would in fact close the gap. But that's not the tactic that was adopted. And from that day onwards, anyone who opposed the voice referendum was belittled. One man was called a bedwetter. Pat Dodson said anyone who votes against it is either racist or ignorant. That's not going to win any hearts and minds in any campaign. And as far as comparing like most people have told me, oh, look, Michael, I can't bring myself to vote against it. Most of my middle-class friends are very supportive of Aboriginal people, and they cannot bring themselves to vote with the Conservative no's, and they can't bring themselves to vote no. And their argument is that it's a step in the right direction. But is it? As Kerry mentioned in her talk, ATSIC was an advisory body. During its time from 1989 up to 2004, when it was demolished, it funded 270 Aboriginal organisations and employed 34,000 Aboriginal people on community development employment programs. So it had resources and the capacity to reach into Aboriginal communities. The advisory body's got none of that. So is it a step forward or a step back? And when we talk about a Prime Minister being on side and we need to take full advantage of his support, keep this in mind. In 2004, when John Howard moved to abolish ATSIC, Albanese voted with him as a Labor Member of Parliament. When Howard was thrown out of office and the Labor Party voted to extend the Northern Territory intervention, Albanese voted for it. And when asked 12 months ago, are you going to shift January 26th so the divisive date of celebrating Australia's move to another date? No, he said, I'm going to retain it. That's our friend, Anthony Albanese. The Yes campaign could have gone about it another way. Should they have gone to the referendum or should they have legislated? Had they gone to legislation, the parliamentary joint committee that Albanese is talking about setting up now, if the referendum is successful, could have been established last year. They would have completed their work and the detail of the legislation would have gone to Parliament and we would have had an advisory body because no one really was going to oppose it. Putting it to a referendum and putting in the Constitution raises fears of people who do have fears about the unknown, who are cautious about their Constitution and will only vote in favour of referendums if there are compelling reasons to do so. And clearly they have decided there are no compelling reasons here. In terms of flexibility, the Yes campaign also failed to stop and think when Peter Dutton came out and said the Liberal Party will not support the referendum. They should have realised there and then that no referendum has ever passed in Australia without bipartisan support. So why are they continuing to push this? Why didn't they go back to Albanese and say, let's stop, let's do it another way? So a lot of mistakes have been made by the Yes campaign, which Aboriginal people in the next campaign, whether it be for treaty or otherwise, must take account of. So what's going to happen after October 14th? If the referendum is successful, as Albanese has already flagged, there will be a joint parliamentary inquiry which will take the rest of this year into next year and probably make its report in winter 2024. Then the Australian Electoral Commission will be given instructions about how to set up elections for the advisory body. Now that would take them several months. By then, by the end of 2024 or the beginning of 2025, there will be a federal election. So nothing else other than the voice to Parliament is going to be discussed on the political agenda for Aboriginal people right up to the next election if the vote is yes. However, if the referendum fails, the voice will be forgotten about in terms of the main policy. The Australian government has already allocated $5.8 million for a national treaty convention. So if the referendum fails, Albanese will not be able to walk away and say, I'm taking my $5.8 million back and I'm walking away. It means that we can go to the federal government by November this year, if there's a lost referendum, and tell him we want to use that money to begin the process of a convention about a national treaty. And very quickly, a national treaty is likely to deliver land, a guaranteed source of revenue, a percentage of the gross domestic product. It would establish a national representative Indigenous body to collect the resources and distribute to Aboriginal communities based on need. And the treaty would have to give discrete Aboriginal communities the right to control health, housing, education, land use and planning, policing and even customary law. The difference between a treaty and an advisory body is that a treaty confers rights on Aboriginal people and imposes obligations on governments, which an advisory body doesn't. So, in a nutshell, it's strange that I would come here and say, look, our best hope for advancement in terms of getting substance for Aboriginal people before the next federal election is if people vote no.
For people who are online, the question is, how is it possible under the Australian Constitution and the Commonwealth Electoral Act to set aside designated seats for Aboriginal people in the Senate? The Constitution provides that the Parliament, as long as it's representative democracy, the Parliament can use its discretion to improve representation of all people in Australia. As I mentioned, each state is allocated 12 Senate seats, and you're right, the electoral boundary is the whole state. So Tasmania, for example, would be the whole boundary of one seat set aside for Aboriginal people. In other words, all Aboriginal people in Tasmania, if they went on to a roll, couldn't vote twice. They couldn't vote in the general election for the other 11 senators. If they went on to a roll, they would vote and stand for an Aboriginal candidate. And all that requires is an amendment to the Commonwealth Electoral Act. It doesn't require any constitutional change because there is this complicated nexus, which we don't need to go into, that if you try to increase the number of people in the Senate, you have to increase the number of people in the House of Representatives. But if you simply take one of the seats of the 12 that are allocated in each state for senators, you don't come up against a constitutional problem.
Greg, we might take one online.
Thanks, Rufus. This is a question that perhaps I might refer to Kerry, because Kerry, I understand that you were involved in the Uluru dialogue. The question is, who from La Trueta was representative at the Uluru Statement, and are all First Nations groups in Tasmania in agreement?
No, I wasn't involved in the Uluru dialogue. I was involved in the voice co-design process of the previous government. Are all Aboriginal groups in Tasmania in agreement about the position on the voice? I think there's pretty widespread agreement amongst Aboriginal people in Tasmania, along the lines that that Michael was talking about. I suspect, though, there are also pockets of confusion, because I have a lot of people wondering to me, what does voice mean? What's all this about? What are we supposed to be doing? Because there's just no information being given by either side of this debate.
Go to another question from the room. Kate.
Yes, I just want to follow up on Michael's point. I mean, I think that his idea of a senator, 6 senators for Aboriginal people, is a wonderful one. But how is that going to pass Parliament? It will require at least, it may not need to go to constitutional change and a referendum, but it will still need Parliament to pass that legislation. And if Parliament can't agree on something as modest as an advisory voice, how are you going to get them to agree to something as radical as special senators for Aboriginal people?
That's always the perennial question, Kate. How do you get the politicians to pass legislation that you want? A couple of things. Peter Dutton said that he would agree to legislate the voice. I know it was a tactic to get away from the referendum, but he did say it. The second thing is that the Albanese government has got the numbers.
Do you really think that he meant that he would agree to senators?
Sorry?
Would he really agree to senators, though? I mean, I think it's one thing to say he might agree with a voice. But
Oh yes, you can only take politicians at their word. The second thing I was going to say is that Albanese has the numbers in the federal parliament. He can get nearly all progressive legislation through, nearly. But if we're ever going to talk about empowerment of Aboriginal people in terms of real power, we're never going to get to that topic while we spend the last 16 years talking about an advisory body. We have been talking about this since John Howard was in Parliament. And this is Noel Pearson's idea, and he is very clever at manipulating the way this whole debate has gone. The third point I'd make is, which follows from that, we need to start talking about real empowerment rather than some subordinate arrangement. We're effectively saying to the people of Australia under this referendum, please, Mr. White Man, when you continue to make decisions about us, will you please let us advise you in your decision? That's 1950 stuff. And if we can raise the discussion onto a level of representation in Parliament, that is, that the makeup of Parliament should reflect the people that they govern. And Aboriginal people have never been in the parliaments elected by Aboriginal people. We've been put there through other parties, but not through our own people. And the legislation wouldn't simply go straight up to the federal parliament. There would be a parliamentary committee. They would have to examine it. They would have to give people all around Australia the opportunity to comment. And so, yes, it would take a few years, but it's never going to begin while we're talking about Aboriginal people being restricted to advisors only.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kerry. It's good to see you. I'm voting yes, simply because crumbs are better than nothing. I've been in this country 30 years, and the aim is to, if we're talking current Prime Minister, if we're talking about Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd, go back to Hawke if you want, is to keep the Indigenous voice down and not to give them agency. We know that. So my question is, what collaboration with other Indigenous people all around the world? You need solidarity. You people need solidarity. The aim is not to give you a voice, a real voice. What work is being done internationally to solidify, strengthen your position when you get into negotiations, whether it's Liberal or Labour? I respect the Liberals. No, go away. I get that. The Labour hypocrisy is really getting to me. Thank you.
I don't know why Michael handed the microphone to me. Being the secretary, or is it president of the provisional government, I would have thought this was something that lowly secretary of the provisional government. I would have thought this was his area. But I will just mention that the problem is that for a full generation now, Aboriginal people haven't really had the capacity to get together on a national level to discuss anything of mutual interest, let alone to engage properly with other Indigenous groups across the country. Now, that used to be done by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, under the watchful gaze of the Australian government, I might add. But there was some capacity there now. And as I said, for a full generation, the government's way of managing Aboriginal people is to choose some people, put them on the payroll, and I don't mean to be insulting to anybody at all, but for various things, and then report back to government. Across the country, there is an Aboriginal leadership sort of as an underlay, a hidden Aboriginal leadership that doesn't really have the opportunity to get together and sort out things on a scale that we really need to be able to do to engage with the government. The lines of communication should be Aboriginal leadership to government. The lines of communication are government appoints some people, go out and talk to the Aborigines, then report back to government, then government makes a decision. So it's an important point you raise, the need to engage with other people in similar situations, but equally as important is the capacity of the Aboriginal leadership across the country to engage as well.
We're getting quite a few questions coming in on the subject of treaty. There's a lot of interest in treaty. So a question from Marjorie on the subject of a treaty. Won't a rejection of the voice just prove to future governments that making further concessions to Aboriginal people is bad politics?
The Australian public are being asked to vote on the voice. They're being asked to decide what rights or what level of rights Aboriginal people should have. So I don't think it's a question of Aboriginal people having the final say on this. The core question is not what Aboriginal people should do. The core question is, what is Albanese going to do if the referendum loses? And if he's a man of his word, where he keeps saying, Aboriginal people have told me that they want this, and that's all I'm doing, then if Aboriginal people tell him after the referendum, particularly if it loses, that we want to talk about a truth-telling commission, which presumably his government would legislate before winter next year, and if we want to use the $5.8 million to have an Aboriginal treaty convention, surely he should be man enough to allow us to do that. But at the moment, he is the one who's saying there will be no other discussions about any Aboriginal political agenda while the voice is before the Australian people in a referendum?
This is the first time I've been asked to opine on Indigenous affairs, being a non-Indigenous Tasmanian. And as someone who wants a vibrant, diverse Indigenous community in Tasmania, where the culture is rich and empowered. Kerry, this is, I suppose, a question to you. We heard from Michael about the desire for a treaty. What specific on-the-grounds activities can we champion to create this culture, which I think would add immense value to the state as well as nationally? The national process seems flawed. We've got little international solidarity by the sounds of it. So what can we do at a state level individually to support you and to empower you to this achievement?
So the question is, as non-Indigenous supporter, what can you do to support
What's the pathway
Aboriginal
that you
people?
see going forward to achieve what you hope to achieve, and then how can we support that?
What Aboriginal people want here is sort of a degree of recognition of who is the Aboriginal community. And the other important thing is the return of land. And our big stumbling block here is, I guess it's political, that the Tasmanian government has its own ideas about who the Tasmanian population might be. And it is growing at a very fast pace beyond anything that can be explained by statisticians. To support Aboriginal people here in Tasmania is to try to understand what it is that we're asking for, but who we are. So it's about understanding history, in my view, listening to people and making your own assessments, because we are being, you might know, we are being challenged by a lot of people who are not Aboriginal, and we are being undermined by the government of the state. So perhaps one of the important things we could do is have some different sort of people standing for Parliament. Not sure that answers your question.
Could I just say a couple of quick things? Until they change the date of Australia Day on January 26th, there's always the big gathering at Parliament House. Please come to that. And also, with the amendments to the Aboriginal Lands Act that are going to Parliament some stage, there'll be all sorts of protests outside the Parliament, so please join us in that.
A question from Deb. Would a successful yes vote necessarily preclude the option of pursuing First Nations Senate seats?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, because Albanese has said for the last 12 months there'll be no other Aboriginal political agenda while we're talking about the referendum. And of course, if it's successful, it means he's already said a parliamentary committee will need to be established. He's put that to Dutton. And the process will take at least 12 months before the voice is complete. So he's already laid it out. There'll be no other discussions with Aboriginal people about anything while the voice is the main political discussion. So the only hope that we've got is if the voice is thrown off the political agenda, and ironically, that's through a no vote. It's a very, we live in very strange days.
Thanks to Michael and to Kerry. Very well put together presentations. My question is basically to both of you. I see myself as what Mick described as one of those middle-class whiteys. And the yes vote seems to me to be based on an emotive campaign, as is the right thing to do. And so my question is, what do you see as the implications if, as Michael was suggesting, the no vote gets up? And what impact will that have on the pathway to reconciliation, which I think everybody would like to see?
a week in politics is a long time, and I think that once the referendum wins or loses, people just move on. The real question will be whether the movement that Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine have generated about this thing about anything that Aboriginal people possibly acquire is racial division, which means they'd oppose the Native Title Act. Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders were the only people in Australia who lost our land. So naturally, we're the only ones they can legislate to give it back to. But on their argument, that's racial division because the rest of Australia isn't entitled to the same legislation. And so one of the interesting things will be, how do we move past an unsuccessful referendum, and how do we close down this emerging stirring of racial division to describe the normality of Australian democracy? I see absolutely nothing with people disagreeing, and those people who are voting yes on emotion, like you said, I think they are genuine. They genuinely want to do something for Aboriginal people and shouldn't be condemned. The people who are voting no are probably not quite in the same boat, but hopefully we can move on from it as quickly as possible after the referendum is done, and just get on with the next political agenda, which I hope is fundamental rights for Aboriginal people, either through a treaty or designated seats.
My fear about the no vote is that promises have been made to Aboriginal people by the Prime Minister and his government. And a lot of Aboriginal people, especially outside the capital cities, have believed those promises. Yes, we'll change your lives. Yes, we'll make us a better country. They have expectations. And I think when Australia votes no, a lot of those people will wrongly see this, unfortunately see this, I should say, as just a vote against Aborigines, because we see how many people now the Yes campaign have got on the television saying vote yes and waving balloons and banners around. Is a very happy thing, and I think there's going to be a lot of sadness and disappointment after a no. I do think too the government will probably just be sick of it and move on to other things, because we are 3% of the population, and quite frankly, with the exclusion of all you nice people here, most people simply don't care. They're just not interested. And about a pathway to reconciliation, look, with respect, I don't like this notion of reconciliation, because it's bandied about in all sorts of inappropriate places. And I'm one of the people who believes you can't even be talking about that unless we are on a pathway to Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders to be able to exercise their basic human rights in their own home country.
I think it's a conversation that could have continued much into the evening, but it has come to the point to draw things to a close. And the university's aspiration in gatherings like this was to create a respectful space where a divergence of views could be explored. And tonight I think we've had a wonderful demonstration of that. The capacity for universities to hold a space where deeply respectful conversations can happen, and views we may not share be carefully aired and explored, and that's been a mark of tonight. And I want to deeply thank both Kerry and Michael for enabling us to have that kind of conversation, and everyone who's joined us here and online for making tonight possible. So Kerry and Michael, thank you very much for your rich and important conversations. At the end of this series, I also want to thank Greg Lehman, who has architected this journey of conversations over this period of preparation for the referendum to enable us to have exactly this kind of important conversation. I know that for Greg and his colleagues, these have not been easy times, and the racism and violence we see in the country in many parts has visited us in places as well. So Greg, for your kind of courage and wisdom in shaping this to create a space where a better kind of conversation, a better kind of Australia can happen, I thank you very much indeed on behalf of us all. And from a university perspective, whatever happens in the yes or the no vote in this referendum, we probably continue to return to that notion set out in the Uluru Statement about Makarrata and its importance. The idea that we come together after a struggle based on justice and self-determination with truth-telling at its heart. It seems to us as a university that whichever way that this goes, that's going to continue to be important. If it's a yes vote, it doesn't mean the struggle's over, it means it's barely begun. It offers another means and a way in which it might proceed forward. Likewise, if it's a no vote, and we've heard it clearly tonight, that is just the beginning of a different pathway to a more just future. Well, the one thing we probably all agree on here is that what did happen starting in 1788 was a journey that ultimately caused untold destruction in this nation to its first peoples, to its Aboriginal people, but who have remained strong and powerful and wise and courageous through all of that time. But the injustices for all of that remain. And those words in the Uluru Statement are worth us all calling back to heart. We are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth language in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. We all recognise the urgency of these issues and the importance of whatever happens in keeping the conversation alive, of creating the space where we can come together to find whatever path it will take to seek truth and justice, self-determination and treaty. And that wherever that is, it needs to be alive in Australia, and we all need to be asking ourselves, how do we walk that path, whatever happens in this referendum? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rufus. Greatly appreciated, and again, thank you to Michael and Kerry for joining us this evening. Thank you again to all of you in the room here with us tonight and online for joining us for the University of Tasmania's third and final panel to discuss the referendum on the proposal for a voice to Parliament. Before we head to the polls, that's beginning to happen this week. The Australian Electoral Commission are loading up the boxes and the mobile polling booths into aeroplanes and four-wheel drives and boats and heading out into remote communities today. And also pre-polling will be beginning very soon as well, ahead of the actual polling day. I know all of you will be taking away a greater capacity to be thinking critically and carefully about the task ahead. It's a very simple one. It's a yes or no. But of course, the great mystery is what either of those choices will lead us to in the future. We'll find out, and it'll be in our hands what we make of the opportunities that flow from either of those choices. Island of Ideas began as a way of connecting our community with ideas while we were unable to host face-to-face events during COVID. But we continue to broadcast these events across the world in the hope that we can connect the people and the ideas from Tasmania to a global network of collaborators and thinkers so that we can work together to co-create a better future. And I hope that's exactly the task that we've commenced and will continue doing tonight. Once again, thank you all for taking part in this special event. And on behalf of the University of Tasmania and the Island of Ideas team, have a happy and safe evening. Good night.